Hello. So, let's give this a second to make sure it's actually working. Okay. Yeah, good. So, earlier this evening, I read a report from an acquaintance who, this is just one story of many, many like this I keep encountering that I relate a lot to. He had expressed how he comes from a scientific background, but he's been having a lot of spiritual experiences that hey Rob, he asks pain in relationship to relationship. That isn't quite what I mean. I'm not considering science to be the same as relationship here. Yeah, so my acquaintance here had so he had this contrast of, okay, so I have this scientific background, I have all this technical understanding, I understand how the world works, and I have these ideas of how even these spiritual experiences might arise from the brain, but then I have them. And there's a kind of disturbance that happens. There's a sort of conflict. The fact that there's a conflict seems really important. It's really, really a powerful vector, a powerful force in the background. From what I saw, he's still struggling with this. I've seen, I've gone through something similar too. There are lots and lots and lots of accounts of this. I'm going to try to give a few examples to point at what the thing is that I'm talking about. So I co-founded something called the Center for Applied Rationality. Many of you watching this probably know that. Many don't. I built the company with a couple of other people. I built its infrastructure, its basic methods of doing curriculum design and curriculum testing, and supplied something like a third of its curriculum, and was one of the main teachers for about 7 years. I eventually left that, but the context of CFAR, that company, was using techniques of researched rationality, which is it's a domain of research in cognitive science and psychology and economics. Like, what is clear thinking? What is it? How do we understand it? How do we come to understand it better? How do we do it? There's a lot of academic work, and basically what we were trying to do was take that and convert it into a practice system and a training system and a community of practice. We started bringing in some things that weren't just from the literature. Whoops. Surprising. So the so part of the context of all of this included this strong rooting in scientific thinking. There was an attempt to gather data and examine what we were doing, whether it was working, how we knew it was working, to apply hypothesis testing and statistics to our methods. I have a different opinion about what some of the driving forces were behind that now, but there was a sincere conscious effort to actually follow, as best as we could in a very messy domain, what a scientific process would be. And in particular, we absorbed a lot of things from scientific culture. Those included things like, you use the standard set of examples like homeopathy and astrology as things that when people start believing in these things, you view them as having made a really basic rationality mistake. I brought in a few more exceptions, highlighting, we don't really know for things like talking about chakras. I don't remember who introduced chakras. It might have been someone else too. But there was a culture of some flexibility, of noting, no one's smart enough to be completely wrong, and maybe ancient people weren't just idiots who just needed science. There might be more to it. So can we understand what they should have been talking about when referring to these different systems, like with chakras, or when talking about channeling gods, or any of this stuff? Can we see what the actual thing is underneath it? But I went through a number of transformational experiences, and some of what I kept running into is, oh, this focus on rationality is actually a little confused. It's like as right as that perspective can get, but there's something missing. And in particular, I would find myself with a kind of challenge about, well, where are my insights and where's my clarity about rationality not being enough coming from? There's a logic loop that I would get stuck in. And I used to have a decent amount of stress about this, because on the one hand, well, science says that all these are brain phenomena, and how do I know I can trust the brain phenomena? It's just a chemistry thing. Maybe it's feeling of insight. And on the other hand, when it happens, it's incredibly obvious that that's not what's going on. I mean, maybe it's mediated by the brain, sure, but it's not an accident. It's not a mistake. And there's a vast clarity, an immense cutting clarity with a lot of these spiritual experiences. Not all of them, and some of them come with conviction of that style of something false. But I think there's some interesting quirks about the history of science that highlights actually science is built on these things. Oh, I realize I want to go meta for a moment about why I'm talking about this, why I'm bringing this forward. I've encountered this a number of times, and there's something very personal to me about the meaning of this discussion. It keeps coming up in a whole bunch of contexts. And I want to have the skill of offering what I see cleanly. I notice that there are places here where I want to share things and add a little bit of an edge, like, and then people think this, like I'm wanting to put a little jab in, a little energetic oomph. So I'm wanting to catch those and clean them out. So part of this is me showing up to see, can I just offer this? Can I just say, oh, I actually have something just to share, something clear to point out. Can I do so from a place that is clean? And if I can't, where is the can't? Where is the hiccup? And can I use that for my own internal processing? So for me, that's the edge that I'm playing with for this evening. So back on the object level. So one other example in this cluster, which may seem very different, but I think is very telling, it's highlighting the way in which what I'm talking about it has a lot of different facets, but it's one thing. I now hang out with and can talk with a lot of people who really believe in astrology, among a bunch of other things. But I had to, well, I didn't have to, but it was fun to be able to dig into some of the esoteric philosophy and like the origins of astrology and some of the stuff with alchemy and so on, in order to like speak this language and see, well, how would I fit this and how does this to my own experience, the same way I would look at chakras before or anything else. Like how do I live this and see it clearly without getting sucked into it? And one of the things that I would keep encountering are these claims of, hey, did you know there was this scientific study that showed, and it'll come up with all kinds of things, but there's something about there being some sort of correlation between somebody's sun sign, what is your sign in astrology is usually referencing the sun sign. So like what time of year were you born, what month approximately. There's some correlation supposedly between sun sign and occupation. I haven't examined the study, but also I don't care. The reason I don't care is that there's this pattern where like it's the same thing that causes people who are really into things like the law of attraction to highlight, oh no, this is quantum physics. Like quantum physics shows the way that consciousness can collapse quantum waves. It makes reality come to a specific thing, like with the double slit experiment. And that is, this is showing us that our consciousness creates our reality. So if you just focus on the reality that you want, like every time I hear that, there's like a couple of reactions that show up in me. I'm actually just now noticing, some of those aren't clean. This is good to notice. So for me, a couple of energies shoot up. One of them is no, that's false. That's not what quantum physics says. I can describe it in some fair amount of detail. Why it is that quantum physics doesn't say that. I can see where you got the impression, but it's basically a word game. There is a question in quantum physics, something called the measurement problem, but it's very different. And you not only would saying conscious observation is what does it, that wouldn't resolve it, but also you wouldn't want it to. You really wouldn't want it to. It would imply something pretty atrocious about the nature of consciousness. If you're going to rationalize some conclusion, you don't want to rationalize that one. But the other thing that shows up is this a sort of an empathic pain, a reaction that recognizes, oh, I can see why you want to say that quantum physics validates your belief system. The basic issue is that the belief system is creating some sense of meaningfulness. It's giving some sense of way of how to orient to life, how to be a good person, how to engage in a way that feels like there's any control over one's life, to have some orientation to what it means to develop spiritually. We've as a general, I don't say as a culture, but like it's Western culture and Western culture writ large, but Western culture has mostly taken over the world. So anybody listening to this, what I mean is humanity, with some exceptions, like there are some indigenous tribes and cultures that haven't had the Western impact yet. But for the most part, humanity is in a globalized culture that systematically destroys the capacity to access stable meaning. I mean this in the sense of, like, if you go back 1,000 years in Europe, what it meant to live if you wanted to have a more meaningful life, you knew what to do. You go talk to your priest. You go to Mass, I think, once a week with everybody else in your village, and you eat of the flesh and drink of the blood of your God. You feel the connection. It's intimately there. There's a sense in which you are working with the creation of God. There's an immediacy to the lived experience of the meaningfulness of participating in your own faith, if you want it. But it's there, and there's no question. Nobody questions it. Maybe somebody questions it, but they're just crazy. No one listens to them. There's, in one sense, science has done something really fantastic by helping us to understand how to extract truth from reality, how to penetrate through even the delusions of our minds, because our minds are capable of understanding the world because of the pattern matching mechanisms, but the pattern matching mechanisms can also become a cage that we can't see through. The same things that give us insight can cause delusion. So one of the fantastic cores of science was looking at this, recognizing, oh, we can develop methods of intentionally and systematically cutting through this. By the way, science didn't invent this. Science figured out a couple of quirks that allowed power to manifest in the world in a very demonstrable way. But these conversations were happening 2,500 years ago at the axial revolution. This is arguably what the Buddha was talking about. This is what people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were struggling with. This question of, how do you deal with self-deception, given that the tools of self-deception are the same ones we use for insight? So science is not really a modern invention. It's just that there was a tipping point that allowed us to translate that question into power. And that's what created so much of the control over the physical world. It was a pretty dramatic shift. But when science, the move that science did was a kind of isolating, cutting move. So now with things like, oh, well, what if that person who's questioning God has a point? Well, the problem with listening to that is not, um, it's not just about feelings, and it's not just about hurt egos. It's about, if we listen to that person, like we're in the village from 1,000 years ago, we listen to that person and then we bring in their ideas and we examine the world and we find out, oh, actually the church's teachings don't match up with our lived experience of the world. This isn't just innocent information. We've just destroyed the cultural foundation of meaning making. That's a really significant problem. That's a really big problem. Right? So how do we deal with that? Well, traditionally, we deal with it by refusing to listen to things that have any potential to threaten our meaning-making systems. That's a default strategy that a lot of us use. And it's also the strategy that the scientific culture uses. So we've inherited this big, big problem. This big problem, which is that the very source of our power over the world has become a method by which we systematically destroy our meaning-making methods. So this gets experienced as, for instance, you can have a spiritual experience and get how all this is here, who you are, what real even means. You can see it for yourself. And then, as you come back into your normal way of being, you can watch your ego boot up. You can watch your mind add, well, but was that just my brain doing something weird? But I was so certain. I can still feel the echoes of the certainty. But wouldn't that be a thing the brain just does? Like, not everybody does this kind of gesture, but it's possible. So I want to speak a little to how I resolved this in myself. I feel like I have a complete resolution to this for myself. And when I look around, as far as I can tell, if this were communicable, I think this would actually just resolve the problem. Now, I'm not going to address the side of what about people who have a meaning-making system that they're protecting by referencing science. It is a slightly different strategy, and I think as I reflect on it and as I feel into this, it might not make sense for me to talk about that dimension. But I want to talk about this way in which it feels like there's a conflict between the insights of spirituality, a direct spiritual experience. I don't mean spiritual teachings, although those are often speaking to the thing, but I mean the direct thing of, oh, right? When the oh becomes really clear and obvious. The way in which that conflicts with science. It doesn't inherently, but in practice it often does. And it creates a lot of stress for people. After some of my own experiences while working in CFAR, there's this feeling of looking around like, I just disagree with the entire materialist framework that these people are working under. But I feel like I'm supposed to not disagree because that's irrational. And somehow I just couldn't quite get my mind to do all of the loops needed to sort out what the conflict is really about. Now I feel very clear about it. So that's what I want to share here. In a 20-minute prelude. But the essence of it is very quick, and I've actually said it in some of my earlier videos in this series. So the basic problem is that science is a tool. And that's not inherently a problem. I want to be careful with this language. Sorry, it's not the language I want to be careful of. I want to be aware of where I'm coming from when I'm viewing something as a problem. When we talk about, so for the most part, there's this inherited mostly scientific worldview. And it's worth painting this picture just a little bit. There's something to track about. Supposedly we're just atoms, right? It's just, this is all just machinery. There's nothing alive here. Alive is an illusion. Right? This is the standard scientific picture, but you go into the scientific sandbox. What does it say? Oh, well, that that atoms form molecules, molecules form proteins, and proteins form cells, and these cells form organs, and organs form an organism. And because of quirks having to do with how all of these pieces come together, somehow, we don't know how, but somehow this produces a you, and a me, and a human society. There's a lot of details that we don't know about this. Probably the biggest one is that we don't understand how consciousness arises. This gestures towards something called the hard problem of consciousness. That how is it possible for matter moving around according to mathematical laws to create this kind of interaction such that the incoming impact of a certain frequency of light somehow, by some chain, gets translated as the experience of color. Like the conscious experience of what we're encountering. How do you do that gap? Most philosophy arguments basically come down to the point that there must be a way to bridge it because there's an interaction. Like if there's any interaction between my seeing something green and my saying, I'm seeing something green. If there's any relationship between them, then there must be some causal interaction between my experience of the greenness and my description of it. And since the description is at the physical level, that means that the physical and conscious levels must be connected. To which I would say anybody, there's a sort of sense in the, from I want to say from a more spiritual point of view, but I don't mean a spiritual ideology. I mean there's a type of perspective that is grounded in truth, not a dogma, not a belief system, but is looking at what is truth, and then going into experience to register exactly what truth is, and then grounding in that, looking around and going, well, duh. Of course there's a connection between consciousness and matter. Behold, here I am experiencing it. I'm getting a little off track just a bit here. So the problem is that if it's all just matter interacting according to math, your living and dying is an epiphenomenon. It's just this extra thing. It's like a wave on the ocean. What does it matter? It doesn't, in some kind of fundamental sense. If you die right now, if you torture people or are tortured, if you do good things, doesn't matter, because it's just matter moving around. The impression that it matters at all is an illusion. It's created by these brains zipping around, having these experiences, but so what? There's a philosophy problem, which is not just an abstract thought thing, but there's a very practical issue with what does it even mean for the wiggling math to create brains that can experience? It's actually a pretty big issue, and this cuts to the core of what I'm looking at. But it's that's a difficult angle to cut out, so I'll sidestep that one for a moment. So most people don't think about this, from what I can tell. Most people don't really take this seriously and look around and ask, what is it for? And how do I reconcile the kind of worldview I have where I am born, I stomp through life, and then I die? And like there's some question about, is there life after death? Different groups have different opinions, but there's no unifying idea. And the the official stance, like the closest thing our modern world has to priests anymore. This has become quite challenging over particularly the last 5 years, but the closest thing that we have to priests anymore are scientists. And the official scientific stance is that there is no life after death. But there might be a brain phenomenon. It's arguable that there might be some sort of brain phenomenon that sometimes happens as a brain is dying that can create a subjective experience that produces some of these things that people talk about in terms of near-death experiences, seeing a light, etc. But from a scientific point of view, the official theory of how the scientific community approaches this is that even if there are such experiences, they are illusions of a dying brain, and that once the brain is actually dead, there is no person there. The person is the brain, approximately speaking. The person is specifically the connectome, the organization of how the neurons are interconnected. So we don't typically, as a culture, focus on that. But it's worth tracking that there's something devastating relative to what it would have been like 1,000 years ago. Like, what does it mean to be a good person today? How do you choose to be a good person? If you don't know, to whom do you turn, or to what organization, or to what teachings do you turn in order to cultivate becoming a better person? What does better even mean? We can't answer that anymore. We disagree about the answer. We have too many answers, and the answers fight with each other. There's no framework for orienting to it. And so when you see the answer yourself, it's then very hard to fit in culture. It's really hard. And yeah, I will straightforwardly claim, yes, there is an answer to these questions. That's very clear. It's very, very clear. But it's something that, when translated into thought, tends to become an ideology. It tends to become a belief system. And that is antithetical to the answer itself. This is why Zen does what it does. Zen's approach has been, okay, let's just shove people towards the answer and not try to explain it at all. I mean, there's some mild attempt to explain it, but only enough to say, you're walking that way. Towards what? You'll see. Why do I want to go? You'll find out when you get there. That's part of what makes Zen unique in the spiritual elements. It's providing absolutely minimal structure and saying, just do it. Do what? Yeah, exactly. Just do it. You need some instruction. Sit and stare at a wall. Focus. What does focus mean? You're not focusing. You know the answer. Just pay attention. And it only takes, 20 years to get there via Zen. So I claim there is an answer. And a lot of my own work has to do, at this point, having seen it and finding myself deepening my relationship to it. Coming to recognize, I can practice it. And in practicing it, I come to see it more clearly as well. So that's something I'm not really interested in debating with people, although I'm happy to discuss. To me, it's beautiful. It's an important part of being a human in this strange world where we pretend that we're experiencing time. So the basic challenge, the really basic challenge here is that the worldview of science claims implicitly to have a right on the claim to truth. But there's a loop. There's a very particular loop that creates a lot of confusion. When we grow up in this context where the priests of science, and I don't mean to degrade scientific accomplishments or the attempts of people to be clear, I'm describing something like a social function. What is meaningful? What is true? To whom do we turn in order to answer these questions? 1,000 years ago, you would have turned to priests. today there is no culturally coherent answer, but the closest thing that we have on the mainstream is, well, at least it used to be turned into science. Now it's getting torn apart, and there's some inclination to turn towards the ideology of the social bubble that you are in. So you end up with some very, very strange claims. I sort of wonder if there's going to be some point at which someone is going to start claiming that there is no biological component to gender. That's going to be interesting. Okay, how distant from physical reality do we want to get at this point? So this used to vex me about something like, am I just going insane? Am I just going crazy? Because I can't seem to translate all of these things into the scientific framework. But the reason is very clear. There's a particular sort of mental move that if I ever find the art of being able to teach this, it's a mental tool that the mind can use in order to pop out of its own traps. It's beautiful. It also makes it capable of building some of the most fantastic traps possible. I've been struggling with some of those now, so it's not entirely clear whether this particular program is. I don't know if this leads to anything like spiritual awakening, but it does offer a kind of clarity. It cuts through a certain sort of problem and allows the mind to come through intact and usable, which is quite remarkable in a lot of spiritual contexts. But the tool applied in the context of science ends up pointing out this. Where does the math come from? And I don't mean this like, oh, I'm the first person to think to ask this question, but the challenge here is if you're actually sincerely asking this question, you can't answer it from within the framework of the math. I mean, you can't. Sorry, that's not quite true. That's not quite true. Let me be a little more specific. What I was actually visualizing there is when I set aside the thing about the math. What I mean by that is if you have a scientific discovery, like you find out, oh, here is how this part of the brain works. Well, it turns out that the way in which, let's take a potentially meta example, but I think this works quite well. Let's suppose that we discover something that goes, aha, this particular network effect here is in the brain is what causes consciousness. And here's the evidence, here's the philosophy, here, like we have figured this out, but boom, we're done, bam. That's where consciousness comes from. It's this machinery in the brain. So here's a challenge. How do you know about the discovery? You can't use the discovery in order to explain how you know about it. Right? Because you didn't know about the discovery before you knew about it. So how do you come to know about it at all? Okay, so this gets very slippery because there's this pop that the scientific framework keeps adding. It's this little bit of complexity, which is, well, if we can explain it within the scientific framework, then we've explained it. But if what you're explaining is the framework itself, then you end up with infinite recursion. It's not stable. Or, at kindest, you end up with self-reference. It turns out that there is a mathematical rule about the limitations applied to a complex system with self-reference. Okay, so I won't go into the math too much, but I'm trying to highlight sort of the intuition about what the relationship is, about what the math implies, what the math guides the eyes, the consciousness to do with relationship to this. If somehow my ability to experience is explained in terms of this brain theory, than saying, oh, well, I can experience this brain theory because this brain theory is correctly describing. It's going to be because of these mechanisms in this theory. This is how I'm doing it. But that's not how you're doing it. Demonstrably, that's not how you're doing it. You are learning about the theory by experiencing it. And then by experiencing the theory, you are then tracing what the theory says and noticing that the theory does not contradict the act of experiencing it in the first place. Now, this is a little slippery. Minds usually have to practice going through this kind of logic a few times in order to follow through. The reason this is important is because there's this way in which the thing that Western minds, there's a very specific slip that Western minds have trained themselves to do, which is, here is the theory, and here I am in the theory, and therefore this is why I am interacting with this way. There's this pop, like a failure to notice who's looking. From where are you looking? You have only ever seen the world from behind your eyes. I mean, not literally from behind your eyes, but like you don't see the world. Basically, nobody has ever seen the world from space. Obviously, astronauts are an exception. But if I ask you, is the Earth a globe, and you get a visual, what is the perspective that visual is from? Okay. We often forget the perspective that we are seeing from. Forgetting the perspective doesn't mean it's not there, but it is very important because that perspective is the center, as far as I can tell, it is the center of basically every spiritual question. Who are you? Who are you? Who is watching this video? Can you tell when your mind boots up thoughts and they block your ability to see? Oh, I'm thus and such person. Oh, I know this theory. This is coming from blah, 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 blah. Those thoughts are things you are looking at. The scientific worldview is something you look at. We can't live in a materialist world. That doesn't make any sense. What we can do is create a mental framework that we can look at, and then we can look at the framework instead of the world. So when we do something like, oh, my conscious experience is coming from, like I'm looking inside the scientific framework, right here is this way in which the brain operates in this kind of way, and that produces consciousness in this sort of way. All right, so that's how consciousness works. So and there's almost like I'm looking at an icon of myself in this model of the world, and this icon of me is looking at this model of the brain and going, and then I am experiencing this model of the brain because my brain here matches this model here, and that's how that works. So this is just true. But you're missing, this is where seeing all of this is coming from. It's always there. It's always right there. You can't lose it. All that can happen is that the mind can stop reflecting it, and you can start getting entranced by your mind as it runs off, ignoring you. That's all you can do. So the reason this feels like just a solid resolution to me, I'm noticing that as I'm describing this, I'm going to need a few cycles of trying to articulate this. I'm glad I gave this a shot tonight. But there's this issue where, how does my knowing anything come about? It's not coming from because this theory is true, because how do I know about the theory? This is part of why I gesture towards where does the math come from? All of science, well, pretty much all of science, there's some exceptions, but the basic paradigm goes that all of the various fragments of science ground out in some sort of chain, like all of biology ultimately grounds in chemistry, all of chemistry ultimately grounds in physics, all of physics ultimately grounds in some sort of mathematical laws that somehow govern the physical world. But how do we know that the math even works? How do we know that 2 plus 3 is 5? We don't know it because we go through an analytic process and thereby validate, because, well, then how do you know that you can trust the analytic process? There isn't a pathway by which you say, oh, well, this loop of structures of logic validate each other and therefore we can trust it. Because how do you get the therefore? How do you know? Where are you in fact grounding your knowing? It's not in thought. Every single system of thought and belief ultimately grounds somewhere in the knowing that is beyond thought and belief. It grounds in truth. It's the only place to ground. The same place from which I know that I feel my tongue in my mouth. I don't go through a whole bunch of theories, I just see it. Well, feel it in this case, but I know it. That knowing isn't a bunch of logic. The logic checks to see whether this direct relationship to truth is reflected in my model. But if it isn't, that means that the model doesn't reflect reality. So in my experience, spirituality is the process of relating to truth. But this isn't lexical truth. This isn't propositional truth. It's relating to the ground. Often quite literally, can you experience the ground you walk on? Coming from that kind of perspective, that kind of lived experience, it's actually very straightforward to interact with things like, oh, okay, my personal guess is actually that science will never be able to actually resolve the hard problem of consciousness, because I think that it can make some progress with some pieces of it, but science would have to become something different to expand its framework enough to account for the perspective that is beyond the scientific framework. Science would have to become self-referential in a way that it's never had to do before. And then a particular quirk known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem actually comes to bear on what science can and cannot say or do. And even if science were to transform itself that way, I don't know if it would go far enough. I don't mean that these things are beyond the ability for us to know rationally. I'm meaning it very specifically in terms of there's a very particular scientific materialist framework in which everything is built up from math, in some sense. We don't ask where the math is. Is the math in the universe? Is it around the universe? Is it atemporal? If it's just an absolute truth in some sense, how do we know about it? How do we get access to it? It certainly isn't through our senses. It's sort of revealed through our senses, kind of, but then how do we know that there's something to reveal? That seems like an assumption we're operating under. How is this working? why are we assuming this? This is philosophy of science stuff. But in practice, no one cares. It's not important for doing science because science is a tool. It's like worrying about the deep psychological meaning of a hammer. You pick up the hammer, you hammer in a nail, you put the hammer down. You don't confuse whether or not your existence is made of hammering. You just use the hammer. Science is a tool. I feel vividly clear about this. It's absolutely clear. I have not seen anything to suggest that how to say that? I'm not concerned about science being able to determine that my consciousness, let's say that. I was about to say something more specific than what I mean. I do not hold to a materialist worldview. I do not think that we live in a materialist world. I'm quite confident that we don't. But that is actually not quite what I mean, but it's close. It's very close. It doesn't make, we live in a material world. It's very clear. But that doesn't define what we live in. It's sort of like asking, is the sky blue or is it big or other? Which of the three? Like, well, sort of depends on what you like. I think it's pretty. Like, these are tools. All of them are tools. But when we stop using the tools, if we set aside all of the thoughts and we just look, and we see what's there, here it is. Here it is. And then there's no problem. There is no problem at all. You only run into a problem if you believe the thoughts that try to insist that all of experience somehow fit inside this box, without accounting for the fact that by building the box and you looking at it, you are already outside of it. And there's no reason to build you in the box. What's that for? Like, the whole reason for building these in the first place is that they are tools you can use. So you need to see them. You need to be able to work with them. That's what they're for. This is what the mind is for. It is a tool. And a tool maker. So no theory is correct. That doesn't mean there's no truth, but it does mean that you're not going to name it an ideology. Even an ideology that is as powerful as scientific materialism. I want to be clear that what I'm saying is not scientific materialism is false. That's part of why I was rewinding a couple of times there going, that isn't quite what I meant to say. I don't mean that I can point at, here is a proof that scientific materialism is wrong. That would be proposing the challenge that within the framework of scientific materialism, you can run an experiment to show it is internally incoherent. I don't know how to do that. I suspect that the materialism is a pretty consistent framework. I don't see an inherent problem with it yet. But it's never going to capture me. And it's never going to capture you, no matter what your mind may tell you. So, as a writer, I have some sort of sense of, okay, that was an okay first draft. And I would want to loop it through, and then I might even just take that whole thing, scrap it, and just start over. So I might give another shot at trying to articulate this at some point. So I think I can say it more briefly and more impactfully. And I think I can nail, oh, this is the point, this is the point, this is the point. I would love to be able to do that. Because if this is a huge burden. This is a huge burden for me, and I see it in other people. And if I can offer my own experience and my own resolution for this to others, I think this would be really helpful. It would be really, really helpful. Just kind. And I'd like to offer that. So if you've watched all the way through this, hopefully this made some kind of sense. And if you want to ask about it, feel free to pop a question in the comments. Just be sure to tag me. I've discovered, this is, sorry, let me clarify, because I'm posting this on YouTube as well. So on Facebook, if you are watching this as a replay and you have a question or a comment to make about this, make sure to tag me, because otherwise I won't see it. Something about Facebook's notification settings just won't tell me anything unless I'm tagged, specifically for things that I post as live streams. If it's on YouTube, you can just comment as usual and I should see it. That's all I have for now. We've gotten all the way to this. Thanks for listening. And hopefully, hopefully that made some sense.